Donald Trump's behavior at his rallies is becoming more and more erratic.
I always get criticized because they agree that I'm true, but why would I bring it up so much? Because it's so simple. It's not a horrible plot. It's not a complex thing that people get bored with, Uncle Sam. It's just basic. She said she worked so hard, she sweated over French fries at McDonald's, and she never worked there.
But on Friday, September 27th, an expert group of 18 non-partisan experts representing psychiatry, law, political science, economics, history, journalism, climate and nuclear science gathered at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. for a conference on the more dangerous state of the world and the need for fit leadership, subtitled The Much More Dangerous Case of Donald Trump. This is the second of two videos bringing you highlights from the World Mental Health Coalition Conference and its findings, starting with the conference organizer, forensic and social psychiatrist, Dr Bandy Lee.
Psychiatrists, psychologists, and other mental health professionals were among the first to recognize the dangers of a Trump presidency. This is why, in 2017, we came together to hold a conference at the Yale School of Medicine to discuss our duty to warn as a part of our professional societal responsibility.
I'm a lawyer, and I'm telling you, there's not much we can do for you now. We have seen more and more presidential power with fewer and fewer checks coming from Congress and from the courts. We have to take extraordinary care to make absolutely sure that the person who holds the highest office in the land is mentally fit, morally fit for office. But I want to emphasize how important it is to hear from mental health professionals, such as Dr. Bandy Lee, who have the right, the constitutional right to speak their minds. The Goldwater Rule restricting their freedom of speech. Private associations seeking to restrict the freedom of speech of their members are doing grave harm to our democracy.
The founders feared that every so often in a democracy there would be a Trump. They knew it would happen at some point. They didn't know at what point. And many of us are still trying to figure out what's the combination of psychological, social, cultural, historical factors that have created the opportunity for a Donald Trump. But they knew there would be one. And the reason they knew there would be one was because a flaw in democratic theory that was known by the social contract philosophers was that humans is a flaw in human nature, that humans are vulnerable to demagogues, and that demagogues can draw out what the social contract philosophers described as the passions of the mob. And what Abraham Lincoln might have described as the lowest demons of our nature. And that is what Donald Trump has done. I think we're all in agreement that the White House is not the appropriate institution to house Donald Trump. Certainly not for the next several months or for the next several years. What I want to describe is a couple of things. One is there's been a lot of discussion of Donald Trump's psychiatric diagnosis, and there's a really important point made earlier by Brigadier General Sanakis about how, and Judy Herman made a similar comment. It's not just a diagnosis that matters; it's to what extent do we know things about this person that make them troubling in particular ways. And in Donald Trump's case, they're troubling in virtually every way, and they can be quantified. Most of you are probably familiar with the self-report personality tests that you can do online of the 5-factor model that tells you that you're extroverted and you're low on neuroticism and you're conscientious and agreeable and open to experience and everyone loves you. If Donald Trump were to do one of those things, he would no doubt, he would describe himself as brilliant, unique, a billionaire, which he is at different points depending on which things he's hawking at that moment. he uses words like in describing potential rape victims, he uses religious language about himself, like the chosen one. If you noticed that the other day when he was saying she would not have been the chosen one, which is a bizarre construction. If you think about the use of that, I don't think those would be what would appear on his how most people would diagnose him. Colleagues and I spent a number of years developing a way to quantify diagnoses of personality, and particularly personality pathology, from anything from the kind of minor stuff that all of us have all the way through more severe personality pathology. I scored Trump on this last week, and I wanted to just describe to you the top items from that instrument. It is intended for use only by skilled mental health professionals. It's not for self-report. It's not written at a 6th grade level. It requires expertise, but you, I believe, will recognize a lot of this description. I'm just going to say them in order. Has an exaggerated sense of self-importance, feels special, superior, or grand, tends to blame his own failures or shortcomings on other people or circumstances, attributes his own difficulties to external factors rather than accepting responsibility for his own conduct or choices. By the way, we developed this instrument 20 years before Donald Trump was in power. So none of this was developed for Trump, although it could have been. Tends to be deceitful, to lie, mislead, tends to engage in unlawful or criminal behavior. When distressed, perception of reality can become grossly impaired. For example, thinking may seem delusional. Seeks to be the center of attention, has little empathy, tends to become irrational when strong emotions are stirred up, takes advantage of others, has little investment in moral values, puts his own needs first, or uses or exploits people with little regard for their feelings or welfare, tends to get into power struggles. I'll just read you 3 more. Tends to be unreliable and irresponsible, e.g. may fail to meet work obligations or honor financial commitments. So a lot of people in New York would have something to say about that. Tends to show reckless disregard for the rights, property, or safety of others, seeks to treat others primarily as an audience to witness his own brilliance, importance, etc. And 2 more that are really important, tends to have extreme reactions to perceived slights or criticism, e.g. may react with rage, humiliation, etc. We saw that in spades in the presidential debate. And Vice President Harris drew it out in the way that Democrats have not figured out how to do before. And finally, experiences little or no remorse for injury caused to others. That's just the first 12, 13 items that are most descriptive of Donald Trump out of the 200 items in this instrument. But the instrument yields scores on personality disorders. And normally, no one ends up with a personality with more than 1, maybe max 2 personality disorders, because in reality, most people don't. They specialize in one. Well, Donald Trump does not specialize. He meets criteria for narcissistic personality disorder, which is kind of obvious. Meets criteria, diagnostic criteria from the DSM-5, the Diagnostic Manual for Antisocial Personality Disorder. Meets criteria for psychopathic personality disorder, which is a little bit different from antisocial. Gets more at the things like the lack of remorse and the internal psychological traits that are involved. Meets criteria for paranoid personality disorder. And that's not even getting into the delusional disorders that a couple of people mentioned, including grandiose and paranoid delusions. The last thing I'll mention about his diagnosis is that back in 2008, also before Donald Trump, we did a study taking the data from several hundred patients with narcissistic personality disorder and used a statistical technique to see if there were subtypes. And one of them was, in fact, malignant narcissism. I had read a lot of Erich Fromm, but did not know Erich Fromm's work on malignant narcissism. And at that time, this is back in 2008. When you correlate Donald Trump's profile with the profile of malignant narcissism, he's well above the criteria. So when people say malignant narcissism, it is a quantifiable thing, and he does, in fact, have it. the place where I'll end is to say that, the founders didn't just expect a Trump. They tried to limit the likelihood and to mitigate the damage that could be done by somebody like Donald Trump. They didn't expect anyone would ever have his lack of honor, I don't think, nor the lack of honor of the Republicans who have supported him and been complicit, and who could have gotten rid of him after January 6th and chose not to out of their own cowardice and avarice and quest for power, which they would have recognized that. But I don't think it was possible for them to even imagine someone with that lack of love of country or just love of honor and self-respect. But they included not only checks and balances designed to reflect the will of the people, but also procedures designed to undo the will of the people if necessary, if they picked a Donald Trump. Among those were electors who could defect. And at that time, the senators were chosen by state legislatures, and it was that way for the first century of our republic, which they saw as a way of, in case the masses, which was landed white men at that time, made a bad decision, it could be undone. We have undone virtually every one of those protections, especially the checks and balances. We've seen that the Congress sat back after an attack on themselves, where they were protected by police who gave their own lives, and 147 of them after that still said, "I will not seat the Biden electors." The Supreme Court's decision to eliminate to provide blanket immunity for the president for crimes he can commit in office was a deliberate attempt, and I think I'm not a legal scholar, but it certainly meets criteria for conspiracy, to participate in the conspiracy that continued through January 6th and has gone on ever since, because it was an effort to say, okay, you're immune from this and you will be immune again. The last thing I'll just add about that is what's most worrisome to me. I'm worried about him getting elected because of our electoral college. There's no way he'll win a popular the popular vote, but that doesn't matter. I'm much more worried about the people that the Trump Republicans have planted throughout the swing states in positions of authority having to do with counting the votes and certifying the votes. Because what we've seen from last time, what held was the 63 courts who said, no, there's no fraud here. But those cases were not brought by people at the local level in those official positions. And on top of it, the Supreme Court taught us with its immunity decision before it made it that it would use delay as a way of deciding cases. Because remember how it waited so long to do that? Well, all it takes is a handful of courts that delay and a handful of cases that get up to the Supreme Court where they delay to pass the deadline, and it goes to the House of Representatives. And there, each state gets one vote. And if it's 26 Republican states and 24 Democratic, like it normally is, then Donald Trump will be installed as the next president. So just in conclusion, sometimes by an extraordinary, and some might say divine roll of the dice, of the historical dice, you get a Benjamin Franklin, a Thomas Jefferson, and a George Washington all in the same place at the same time. At other times, you roll snake eyes, and you get a Donald Trump, a Ted Cruz, and a Marjorie Taylor Greene. These are the times that try men's and women's souls. And to speak to the voters of America, these are the times that try your souls. And you have to preserve our democracy.
Donald Trump is just such a little man and should never again be in control of America's nuclear arsenal. We're lucky to have survived his first presidency and can't risk that our luck will endure through his second one. If there is any position that requires rational judgment, sober circumspection, wisdom, knowledge, restraint, understanding of adversaries, careful deliberation, and empathy, it's the presidency of the United States, a position that makes its occupant one of the two people in the world who have veto power over the future existence of life on this planet. Donald Trump may be the most egregiously unfit person to have that responsibility, but that's a power that no one should have. It is madness that no one stands between the President of the United States and authorization to launch America's nuclear arsenal.
Trump, when he speaks, is an entertainer. He's not a politician. He's not a philosopher. He's just a entertainer, and that's where he came from. But it's not entertaining to think of what he can do. The other part of my own personal history is that I have witnessed a nuclear explosion. In July of 1962, I was on the flight deck of my aircraft carrier in the Pacific, where I was a weapons officer, and I witnessed an ICBM shot 100 miles straight up with a nuclear bomb exploding above the atmosphere of the world. So there was no sound. It lit up the entire Pacific for an hour or so. We blocked out radio communications from Japan to Hawaii, and that was the last above-ground nuclear explosion the United States did. So I am genuinely afraid of what could happen if this man has the nuclear button. He boasted that he has a bigger button than Kim Jong-un. And what we don't talk about is all the other countries that have nuclear weapons, including Israel, including Pakistan, including India, and probably South Africa, and France, and England, all have nuclear weapons. So even when one blows up, we're not going to know where it came from. So we have to have someone who is sane, someone who is reliable, and all the other factors that were mentioned already this morning by the panel. And we have to make sure that this word gets out, that this man is not to be dependent upon. Now, it has been said that we aren't able to diagnose people at a distance. I have to disagree with that, because frequently, as forensic psychiatrists, we're called upon to diagnose people from the death certificates, the medical records, with interviews in jail and places where we don't have all of the lengthy examinations that psychiatrists generally do. You can still make a diagnosis. And that's been done many times with Donald Trump. And it's very clear, as has been pointed out, that his mental faculties are deteriorating. If you try to read any of his speeches given at his rallies, he does not make sense. And it's clear that this is worse than it used to be. It was bad enough at the beginning, but there are signs of cognitive impairment now. And the mass media made much more of Biden's cognitive impairment, which is relatively mild and somehow based upon his history of stuttering when you listen to him. They don't make that much out of Trump's cognitive impairment. You wonder why.
The next president we pick is going to be one of the most consequential decisions any of us have to make, because right now we are on the kind of razor's edge of whether we're going to be able to avoid catastrophic climate change or not. This is a serious problem. We know the solution, and this election is going to decide whether or not we make a vote on behalf of our children, or whether we say, we don't care about our children at all. We do not care what world we live them. We're just going to float through the world. And if we have some bizarre notion that one particular policy of Donald Trump is somehow going to benefit us narrowly, it's still going to destroy the world for our future children and grandchildren.
You can read more about the conference at dangerouscase.org and join me for the weekend show every Sunday as I continue my conversations with Dr. Bandy Lee about the dangerous threat to democracy that Donald Trump poses. I'm Anthony Davis. You can find me on the 5 Minute News YouTube channel, on Wednesdays co-hosting Uncovered, and on Sunday on The Weekend Show with Midas Touch.